There does seem to be, I mean, I suppose this is a systematic whitewashing of nuclear weapons. And I don't even think, for example, that a lot of people might not know that the 6th and 9th of August, which is only last week, it was that anniversary of the US dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So I think the systematic propaganda, the whitewashing of these historical events, I mean, in my rather less informed opinion, it seems to be quite successful. I would like to hear from you, really, what you think about how successful that has been and where we are at right now.
Well, ever since those bombs were dropped, I mean, this was the United States dropping nuclear bombs on civilian populations, right? War crimes on a kind of massive, massive scale. That's the first thing to say. Ever since then, there's been this myth that has been kind of perpetuated, which was that it was necessary to drop the bombs to end the war. Okay, that's the myth. And it is completely false. And it's false because it is well known, there is a huge amount of evidence that Japan was already trying to surrender from early in 1945, even before victory in Europe. And they only had one condition, which was that they wanted the emperor to stay in place and not be convicted of war crimes. Now, you may remember that the emperor, even after the atomic bombing and the complete end of the war, he remained in post and wasn't convicted of war crimes. So that was clearly no obstacle. That was no obstacle whatsoever to negotiating and accepting a Japanese surrender. But the Western powers brushed that under the carpet. I'm talking about the US, basically, because they were in the driving seat on this. They brushed that under the carpet. They ignored that, and they went ahead with their plans. Now, I should say that although there are plenty of people, CND and other organizations, a lot of American historians and so on who have this information and they put it out there, but it's not just people like us who know it wasn't necessary to end the war. People like Winston Churchill, for example, at the time, and very, very major political figures and military figures said, no, we didn't need to hit them with that terrible thing or something. It was recognized. So that leads to a question then. Why did the United States do that if it wasn't necessary? They claimed they did it because they wanted to stop hundreds of thousands of US troops being killed in taking over of invasion and taking over of Japan. That was what they claimed. But so there are a couple of reasons why it's thought or it's shown that they took that position. One was because the Soviet Union had agreed that it would come into the war on Japan after a certain date if Japan hadn't, surrender hadn't taken place. That date for Japanese, for Soviet involvement was coming very rapidly. So they wanted to do something very quick to prevent the Soviet Union, the Red Army, with its remarkable record, in defeating the Nazis in the West. They wanted to kind of prevent the Soviet Union, being part of, say, occupying Japan, for example. So that was one element. But I think the element which strikes me most particularly is that the United States wanted to use the atom bomb to show that it had it and to demonstrate its power in the Cold War world. And that is also very widely recognized by historians and indeed by significant politicians at that time in 1945. And people described it as not so much the last act of the Second World War, but the first act of the Cold War. They were sending a message to the Soviet Union about the power that they had. And another historian described it as, kind of atomic diplomacy, so-called, that this is what we've got, behave yourself. We have this kind of supremely powerful thing. And so they used it for those purposes. I think there were other reasons as well, terrible, terrible things like wanting to actually test such a bomb on a human population, so to speak, as if the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were somehow guinea pigs in testing these nuclear weapons. But, whatever the reason, catastrophic, hundreds of thousands of Japanese people were killed, and the impact, the kind of health consequences of those terrible terrible crimes are still with many people in Japan today. And I would just conclude by saying that what are described as small nuclear bombs in terms of today's arsenal are actually many times greater in power than the bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you could see what a complete disaster it would be for any nuclear weapon to be used.